If you're new here, welcome. We tell the stories your history books left out, so stick around and subscribe. One community on one island carries more DNA from an extinct human species than any population ever measured on Earth. Not slightly more. Up to 46% more than the previous record holders, a figure that took geneticists by surprise when it surfaced in 2021. The species in question is the Denisovans. They're not as famous as Neanderthals, and there's a reason for that. Almost nothing physical survives of them. A finger bone, a handful of teeth, a single jawbone pulled out of high-altitude sediment on the Tibetan Plateau. That's most of what science has to work with. Denisovans vanished from the fossil record more than 40,000 years ago, leaving behind fragments you could fit in a small box. And yet their genetic fingerprint didn't disappear with them. It just moved into the living. Here's the irony. The population carrying the largest share of that fingerprint isn't in Siberia, where the first Denisovan bones were dug up. It isn't in Papua New Guinea, long assumed to be the highest Denisovan population on the planet. It isn't in Australia, home to some of the oldest continuous human lineages known. It's in a country most people picture through a completely different lens. Spanish colonial churches, jeepneys, tropical beaches, a former American territory in Southeast Asia. If Denisovans disappeared from the fossil record over 40,000 years ago, how does one community in the Philippines carry more of their DNA than anyone else alive today? That number will make sense soon. But first, the story almost everyone already believes. Ask most people where Filipino ancestry comes from, and you'll get a version of the same answer: Malay, Austronesian, seafarers. It's not a wrong answer, it's just a much smaller piece of a much bigger picture than the textbooks let on. The standard model has a name, out of Taiwan, first laid out in detail by archaeologist Peter Bellwood at the Australian National University. The story goes like this. Around 4,000 years ago, agricultural communities left Taiwan in outrigger canoes. They island-hopped south through the Philippines, then fanned out, into Indonesia, into Malaysia, eventually as far as Madagascar off the coast of Africa in one direction, and Hawaii and Easter Island across the widest ocean on the planet in the other. It's one of the largest human migrations in prehistory, and the linguistic evidence backs it up hard. Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano. Every major Filipino language belongs to the same family tree as Malay, as Malagasy on the other side of the Indian Ocean, as Maori in New Zealand. Same root, same branch, spread across half the planet. The archaeology lines up too. Red-slipped pottery known as Nagsabaran ware. Jade ornaments quarried in Taiwan and found scattered as far as Vietnam. Rice and root crop farming spreading in lockstep with the pottery and the jade. Piece by piece, it built a clean, coherent narrative. People leave Taiwan, people arrive in the Philippines, people keep moving. One wave, one clear direction, one origin point. For over a century, colonial-era anthropology cemented this into something close to official identity. The Malay race, as it was labeled at the time, became the default explanation, repeated in classrooms, printed in tourism brochures, absorbed as common knowledge long before anyone had the tools to test it against actual DNA. There's just one assumption baked into that story that nobody questioned closely enough. It treats the islands as essentially blank before the Austronesian wave showed up. Empty coastlines, empty forests, a fresh start. Here is where it gets complicated. When geneticists finally got the tools to check that assumption directly, not through pottery, not through language trees, but through the genome itself, the DNA they pulled out of modern Filipino populations didn't match a blank slate timeline. Not even close. In 2021, Dr. Maximilian Lorena and Professor Matthias Jakobsson, both at Uppsala University in Sweden, published a study in the journal Current Biology that remains one of the largest genetic surveys ever done in the region. Their team analyzed roughly 2.3 million genetic markers. Think of it as 2.3 million individual checkpoints along the length of a genome, each one a place where one population's DNA can be compared against another's, drawn from 118 distinct ethnic groups across the Philippines. 25 of those groups were self-identified Negrito communities, some of the oldest continuously documented populations in the islands. Within that dataset, one group stood out for reasons nobody had predicted going in: the Ayta Magbukon, a Negrito community concentrated in Bataan province, on the island of Luzon. The finding Ayta Magbukon carry the highest level of Denisovan ancestry ever recorded in a living human population, 30 to 40% higher than Australians, 30 to 40% higher than Papuan Highlanders, the previous holders of that record. And when researchers mathematically stripped away more recent, unrelated ancestry, to isolate the ancient signal more precisely, the gap widened even further, up to 46% higher. To put the scale of that in context, Denisovans, remember, are represented in the entire fossil record by a finger bone, some teeth, and one jawbone, no skeleton. No Denisovan fossil of any kind has ever been unearthed anywhere in the Philippines, not one. Every trace of that ancient contact exists purely inside the DNA of people alive right now. Lorena's team went further and dated a separate, later genetic event, the point at which East Asian-related, Austronesian ancestry mixed into these same Negrito populations. Their estimate, approximately 2,281 years ago, with a confidence range between 2,083 and 2,523 years. Compare that to the Denisovan admixture signal, which reaches back tens of thousands of years. These aren't two versions of the same event. They're two entirely separate chapters, separated by an almost unimaginable stretch of time. And that number quietly rewrites the story from segment 2. The blank islands assumption wasn't just incomplete. It was backwards. The Philippines wasn't empty before Austronesian seafarers ever launched a canoe from Taiwan. Negrito populations and whatever ancient contact happened between their ancestors and the Denisovans were already there. Tens of thousands of years there. The Austronesian migration wasn't the origin story at all. It was a late chapter, stitched on top of something far older that the pottery and the jade and the language trees never touched. Jakobsen offered an explanation for why the Ayta Magbukon specifically ended up holding this record rather than some other Negrito group. His team found they carry the lowest proportion of East Asian-related ancestry of any Negrito population studied, somewhere between 10 and 30%. Other Negrito communities mixed more heavily with later arrivals, and that mixing diluted their ancient signal over generations. The Ayta Magbukon simply diluted the least. Their ancient inheritance stayed more intact than anyone else's. Diluted, not erased. That's the word researchers keep coming back to, and they're careful to frame the whole picture as probability rather than certainty. Genetic statistics can tell you an ancient population mixed with another population, and roughly how much, but they can't hand you a date stamp or a map pin for exactly where it happened. And that's the open question the entire discovery leaves hanging. Nobody knows where the actual contact between early modern humans and Denisovans took place. Not in Siberia, that's where Denisovans were first identified, not where this admixture occurred. Not confirmed anywhere in the Philippines either, since, again, there is no Denisovan fossil on Philippine soil to point to. The mixing is real. The location is a blank. The first theory researchers point to is the simplest one geographically, the southern coastal route. Under this model, early modern humans left Africa somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago and moved east along the Indian Ocean coastline, eventually reaching Sundaland and Wallacea, the ancient landmass and island chain that connected mainland Southeast Asia toward Australia and New Guinea, when sea levels were far lower than today. The idea is that ancestors of today's Negrito populations crossed paths with Denisovans somewhere along that route, possibly in Wallacea itself, well before ever setting foot on Luzon. This fits a pattern researchers have flagged elsewhere in the region. Similar ancient Denisovan signals turn up in Aboriginal, Australian, and Papuan genomes, at levels usually cited around 3 to 6%, suggesting Wallacea may have been a broader contact zone for archaic and modern humans, rather than a single isolated meeting point. But the limitation is glaring, and researchers don't hide from it. This entire model is built from statistics, patterns pulled out of living people's DNA, not from a single physical trace. No Denisovan fossil, no stone tool tied definitively to a Denisovan hand, no cave site anyone can point to and say, this is where it happened. The interbreeding is written into the genome in unmistakable numbers. The location where it actually took place remains, for now, a complete blank on the map. And that blank gets a lot harder to fill in once you learn something else that was dug up on that same island. Proof that something was already walking Luzon more than 700,000 years before modern humans, or Denisovans, ever crossed paths there at all. That proof surfaced in 2018, when a team led by Thomas Ingiko published findings in the journal Nature from a site called Kalinga, tucked into the Cagayan Valley in northern Luzon. What they found wasn't ambiguous: stone tools, and beside them, the disarticulated bones of an extinct rhinoceros species, Rhinoceros philippinensis, cut, scraped, and broken in patterns that don't happen by accident. Erosion doesn't butcher an animal, hands do. Using electron spin resonance and uranium series dating, Two independent methods that essentially read the radioactive decay clock buried inside bone and sediment. Injiko's team arrived at a number that stopped the field cold, approximately 709,000 years ago. Say that slowly. 709,000 years. Homo sapiens didn't exist yet, not anywhere on Earth. The Negrito migration from Theory 1, the 50 to 70,000 year coastal route, suddenly looks recent by comparison. Something was already on Luzon roughly 640,000 years before that migration even began, and whatever that something was, it didn't walk there. Even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, Luzon was never fully connected to the mainland. Reaching it meant crossing open water, which means some archaic hominin, not modern, not Denisovan by any confirmed identity, just archaic, was capable of a water crossing hundreds of thousands of years earlier than most researchers thought possible for any hominin, anywhere. Here is where Theory 1 starts to wobble. The tidy version of that story had modern humans arriving on empty islands, meeting Denisovans somewhere in transit through Wallacea, admixing once, then continuing on. Clean. Contained. But if Luzon already had a resident hominin population for over 600,000 years before that meeting ever took place, the empty islands one clean encounter picture doesn't hold up the way it did a few minutes ago. The admixture Lorena's team detected in living Ayta Magbukon DNA might not have happened somewhere out in Wallacea, in passing, on the way to somewhere else. It could have happened right here, locally, on these islands, with a population that had already called Luzon home for longer than most species survive at all. Researchers are careful here, genuinely careful, not hedging for effect. Nobody has skeletal remains from the Kalinga toolmakers. No skull, no jaw, no tooth. Just the tools they left behind and the animal they butchered with them. Whoever they were remains, for now, unnamed. The third theory, and it's the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud without a dozen qualifiers first, comes from a different site in that same province. In 2019, a team led by Florent Detroit of the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris announced something that rewrote the human family tree. A new species, found in Cayo Cave, named Homo luzonensis. The remains, teeth and bone fragments from at least 3 individuals, were dated to somewhere between 50 and 67,000 years old, which puts them, potentially, in the same window as the earliest modern human arrivals in the region, overlapping, possibly even coexisting. The anatomy doesn't resolve neatly into any known category. Some of the teeth are small, almost startlingly modern in their proportions. But the toe bones curve, sharply, in a way that echoes species millions of years older, tree climbers like Australopithecus, the kind of anatomy you'd expect in something that still spent real time in branches, not on the ground. 2 different evolutionary eras sitting in the same skeleton. One hypothesis: Homo luzonensis descended from an earlier wave of Homo erectus that reached Luzon, maybe even the same population that left the tools and the butchered rhinoceros at Kalinga, and then evolved in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. Island dwarfism. The same evolutionary pressure that produced the so-called hobbit species, Homo floresiensis, on the island of Flores in Indonesia. Cut off, shrink, adapt, survive, quietly, while the rest of the world moves on. Here is the part the records genuinely cannot explain. No DNA has ever been recovered from Homo luzonensis, not a fragment. The heat and humidity of a tropical limestone cave breaks down genetic material far faster than the frozen ground of Siberia, where Denisovan DNA managed to survive for tens of thousands of years. Which means there is currently no way to test whether Homo luzonensis carries any relationship to the Denisovans at all. A separate branch entirely. A missing piece of the same branch. Nobody can say, not yet. Picture the cave itself, because the physical setting is where all of this was actually found. Cayo Cave. A limestone chamber system cut into karst rock in Cagayan province. Its air cool and damp, even in tropical heat. Thick with the ammonia sharpness of centuries of bat and swiftlet droppings coating the chamber floor. Somewhere above, cave swiftlets chatter and wheel through darkness. Their wing beats the only sound bouncing off stone that hasn't changed shape in tens of thousands of years. 67,000 years ago, that same limestone system sat inside a valley thick with forest, a river system nearby that whoever lived here would have relied on for water, for fish, for the kind of daily survival that leaves almost no trace at all except, occasionally, a bone. Archaeologists working this site over recent years have excavated foot and hand bones small enough to balance on a fingertip. Fragments so small they're easy to miss, yet carrying, inside their curvature and their density, anatomical evidence from 2 different chapters of human evolution folded into one individual. Not a metaphor. A physical fact, sitting in a drawer in a research lab still being studied. Now stack everything. An unidentified hominin population present on Luzon by at least 709,000 years ago. Descendants, possibly, probably, not yet proven, evolving in isolation into Homo luzonensis by roughly 50 to 67,000 years ago. Modern humans arriving separately via the Sundaland and Wallacea coastal route, somewhere in that same 50 to 70,000 year window, and encountering Denisovans either in transit or, just as plausibly now, locally, on the islands themselves. And then, layered on top of all of it, a completely different migration. Austronesian-speaking communities arriving from Taiwan around 4,000 years ago, with genetic evidence pointing to a final admixture pulse into these same Negrito populations roughly 2,281 years ago. 4 layers. Not one story, not one migration. At least 4, stacked on top of each other across more than 700,000 years. Not by years, by entire epochs. The identity most people reach for first, Malay, Austronesian, seafaring islanders from Taiwan, turns out to be the newest layer in that stack, not the foundation, and the community most associated, in the popular imagination, with being part of that recent wave, is the very community, the Ayta Magbukon, whose genome is now the single best living record science has of the oldest, least understood human Denisovan encounter anywhere on the planet. The layer everyone assumed was the whole story turns out to be the last chapter of a book that started hundreds of thousands of years earlier. None of this is settled, researchers are explicit about that, and it's worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. No Denisovan fossil has been found anywhere in the Philippines to confirm where that contact actually happened. No DNA has been recovered from Homo luzonensis to confirm what it actually was. Nobody has proven a direct line connecting the toolmakers at Kalinga to the small-bodied species found at Calao Cave, 700,000 years later. Each piece is real. The threads connecting them are, for now, drawn in pencil, not ink. One geneticist working in this space put it plainly in describing the broader project. Every genome sequenced is another page recovered from a book everyone assumed was already fully written. Zoom out far enough, and this stops being a story about one island at all. Every human population alive today is carrying pieces of relatives who no longer exist as distinct peoples. Neanderthal fragments in the DNA of most people outside Africa. Denisovan fragments concentrated across South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And increasingly, hints of still unnamed ghost populations turning up even in African genomes. Population science hasn't identified yet at all. Which raises a harder question than any single dig site can answer. What does indigenous or native actually mean? In a place where the timeline includes an unnamed archaic toolmaker, a species discovered only in 2019, and a Denisovan contact zone nobody has physically located. Identity, it turns out, was never a single clean line running back to one point of origin. It's closer to a river fed by tributaries nobody had mapped yet, some running back tens of thousands of years, one running back over 700,000, all converging, quietly, invisibly, inside the DNA of people walking around today, who mostly have no idea any of it is there. Researchers studying this region have been clear that ongoing sequencing work may still change this picture substantially. This isn't a closed file, it's an active one. The Filipino were never who we thought. Not Malay, not simple, not a single wave from Taiwan 4,000 years ago. And after 700,000 years of layered arrivals, interbreeding, and isolation, that story still isn't finished being written.